base was quiet in the early hours, almost too quiet. The hum of machines, the soft tapping of keyboards, and the occasional murmur of voices were the only sounds breaking the stillness. From the control room, the view of the surrounding hills seemed calm, peaceful even, like nothing could disturb it. But inside, the tension was already thick. Everyone knew something was off, though no one could put a finger on it yet. The officer in charge of this shift leaned over a console, eyes scanning the flickering screens. He had spent decades in command centers like this one, and experience told him that the calmness of the morning often meant trouble was coming. Something in the intercepted communications didn't sit right with him. He noticed patterns in the data that were too precise, movements in enemy positions that didn't match any previous exercises or intelligence reports. It wasn't just normal preparation. It felt like a warning. Other officers were busy with routine checks, running simulations, reviewing satellite images. They were focused on their own tasks, following procedure. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the base was sitting on the edge of something dangerous, something that could hit them before anyone expected. He moved quietly from console to console, listening, watching, trying to see the bigger picture that most others were ignoring. Outside, the sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the hills. Birds chirped occasionally, completely unaware of the tension below. He looked at a live feed from a surveillance drone hovering over a distant ridge. The imagery was clear, too clear. Movements in the terrain seemed deliberate, coordinated, not random. He leaned closer, frowning. Whoever was out there knew exactly how to stay hidden, yet remain visible enough for reconnaissance. That kind of precision didn't come by accident. The chief of operations walked past, sipping his coffee, noticing the officer's scrutiny. "What is it?" he asked casually. "Something doesn't add up," the officer replied, gesturing at the drone feed. "Their positions, the timing, it's too precise. I've seen drills like this before, but this isn't a drill. They're testing responses, not preparing for defense. They're testing us." The chief raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He was a man who trusted procedure and reports, not intuition. "We've got satellite confirmation on routine troop movements," he said. "Nothing alarming." "You're overthinking this," the officer didn't argue. Experience had taught him that arguments rarely changed minds, especially when the official reports didn't support the intuition. He simply nodded and returned to the screens, but his mind raced. He thought about the last time he had this feeling. Years ago, a small intelligence oversight had led to disaster. The memory still haunted him. He didn't want history repeating itself, not under his watch. Around the base, everything seemed normal. Guards patrolled, soldiers carried out equipment checks, engineers monitored machinery. Even the cafeteria smelled normal as the first batches of breakfast were being prepared. But the officer knew that appearances could be deceiving. He walked to the main communications hub, where a young technician was monitoring incoming transmissions. "Any unusual signals?" he asked. The technician shook his head. "Just standard chatter, sir." "Nothing unusual," he frowned. Something about that answer felt incomplete. He leaned over the console, scanning the raw signal data himself. Hidden beneath the static, there were bursts of coded messages. They weren't obvious, not even to trained eyes, but he could sense the rhythm, the repetition. Someone was communicating deliberately, almost tauntingly, but careful enough not to trigger alarms. "Keep an eye on this," he said quietly. "Don't block it or dismiss it. Watch every burst, every anomaly." The technician nodded, eyes wide. The officer walked back to the command room and took a seat at his console. He pulled up satellite overlays, troop movement charts, and intercepted communications. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but his mind worked fast, connecting dots others hadn't noticed. He mapped the positions of the unknown faction, tracing patterns over weeks. They had been careful, patient, almost invisible. It was as if they were building something larger, testing reactions, studying human responses. Hours passed, and the morning sun climbed higher. The base slowly came alive, the hum growing louder as more personnel arrived. Briefings were held, orders repeated, drills conducted. Most officers treated the day like any other, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. But the officer never relaxed. His intuition screamed that something critical was about to happen. He moved to the main communication array, checking frequencies and signal strength. A minor fluctuation caught his attention, almost unnoticeable. It was fleeting, lasting less than a second. But it was enough to confirm his suspicion. The unknown faction was communicating in bursts, testing response times, and probing for weaknesses. He called a private meeting with a few trusted officers. "We need to consider the possibility of a preemptive strike," he said. "I don't know if they're ready to attack, but they are definitely preparing. And they're watching us. Every step we take, every movement we make is being studied." The room fell silent. No one liked to discuss possibilities that involved real danger, especially before official confirmation. But the officer's reputation commanded respect. They listened closely as he outlined his observations, his reasoning clear and direct. By midday, the sense of normalcy was wearing thin. Signals intercepted earlier had increased in frequency, subtle changes that suggested the unknown faction was now aware that they were being monitored. The officer felt the tension in the air, a tangible pressure that weighed on everyone at the base. He walked among the soldiers, noting their focus, their discipline. They were ready for routine operations, but were they ready for the unexpected? He didn't know, but he hoped his warnings would give them an edge. He returned to his console, reviewing the data again. Something else caught his attention, an anomaly in satellite imagery. A series of vehicles, almost invisible in the forested terrain, were moving in a coordinated manner, forming patterns that mirrored the base's own defensive positions. It was as if the unknown faction had drawn an exact replica of the area, rehearsing movements and strategies. He realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just preparation. It was rehearsal for confrontation. They weren't moving blindly. They were planning, simulating every possible response the humans could make. And now they were ready to act. The officer called the chief again, urgency in his voice. "We've got confirmation. They've been mapping us for weeks. They're prepared and they know our routines. We can't ignore this anymore." The chief's face turned serious, but his expression was tight. "Do you have concrete proof?" "Enough to take precautionary measures," the officer replied. "We need to alert the units, review defenses, and prepare for immediate response." Waiting for proof could cost lives. Orders were finally given. Soldiers moved into position. Defensive measures were checked and double-checked. The base that had seemed calm just hours ago now thrummed with controlled urgency. The officers coordinated, strategized, and briefed teams, each action deliberate, precise. Even as preparations unfolded, the officer felt a gnawing unease. The unknown faction was intelligent, patient, and methodical. They weren't just attacking blindly. They were studying humans, exploiting patterns, learning weaknesses. And the officer knew deep down that the real test hadn't begun yet. As evening approached, shadows lengthened over the base. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a dim, eerie light that made the hills look darker, more foreboding. He stood on a balcony overlooking the perimeter, watching for any signs of movement. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying an almost imperceptible sense of tension. He thought about the coming hours. Something was coming, he was sure of it. And when it did, everything the base had prepared might not be enough. He clenched his fists, determination setting in. If this was the calm before the storm, he would face it head-on. The humans under his command depended on him, and he would not fail them. The first part of the day had passed. The officers had analyzed, strategized, and prepared. But as night fell, the officer knew that the real challenge, the unknown, calculated, and deadly force moving against them, was still out there, waiting, watching, and ready to act. And when it struck, nothing would ever be the same again. The quiet hum of the base continued, machines and systems alive in the dim light. But in that quiet, a warning lingered, unnoticed by most. The storm was coming, and the humans were about to discover the cost of underestimating a careful, relentless enemy. The night was silent, but the officer didn't sleep. He walked along the perimeter of the base, checking sensors and cameras, eyes scanning every shadow. He knew the calm of the evening was deceptive. The unknown faction they had been monitoring for weeks was likely moving closer. Invisible, precise, and deliberate. Every sound, every flicker of light in the distance seemed loaded with meaning. Inside the command center, screens displayed real-time data, satellite feeds, and sensor alerts. Officers huddled around consoles, whispering in low tones, exchanging pieces of information. Despite the sense of controlled urgency, a nervous tension filled the room. Every officer knew that the preparations, drills, and contingency plans might not be enough. Suddenly, a soft alarm sounded. A minor blip on the radar appeared and disappeared in seconds. Most officers ignored it, assuming it was a glitch. But the officer's instincts told him otherwise. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That tiny blip matched no known movement. It was deliberate, timed perfectly. Someone, or something, was testing their responses, probing their defenses. Minutes later, a series of rapid alerts erupted across the command center. Drones detected multiple units moving at high speed across a ridge just beyond the base's main perimeter. The officer immediately recognized the pattern from earlier intelligence: coordinated, calculated, precise. This was no random incursion. This was the first strike. "All units report to battle stations," he shouted, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. Soldiers scrambled, weapons in hand, running to checkpoints and observation posts. Engineers secured sensitive equipment, shutting down unnecessary systems to avoid interference. Officers issued quick, clear commands, prioritizing communication and coordination. Outside, the hills were alive with movement, shadows shifting as vehicles and personnel advanced. The unknown faction moved with a terrifying precision, almost as if they had rehearsed every step in a simulation of the base. Sensors tracked them, but the speed and coordination made it difficult to respond effectively. Inside the command center, the officer monitored multiple screens, tracking each unit's movement. His heart pounded not with fear but with adrenaline and focus. He could see the small mistakes the intruders were making, tiny gaps in formation, slight miscalculations, but those mistakes were rare. For the most part, their strategy was flawless. A transmission suddenly appeared on the secure channel. It was clear, deliberate, and chilling. "You underestimated us. This is what happens when humans declare war without understanding the cost." The voice was calm, almost polite, but every word carried weight, a hidden threat that made the room go silent for a moment. The officer recognized the gravity of the message. This was not just an attack. It was a statement. The enemy was confident, organized, and intelligent. They knew the humans were capable, but they also knew how to exploit human arrogance. He quickly analyzed the timing and content of the message. Whoever had sent it had access to the base's communication patterns. They had watched, studied, and learned. "Signal analysis team, trace that transmission," he ordered. "Find the origin if possible. And be careful, it could be a decoy." Technicians worked frantically, running algorithms and triangulating signals. Every second felt stretched, heavy with anticipation. Outside, the sounds of engines and distant explosions signaled that the engagement had begun in earnest. The first clash occurred at the southern perimeter. Security teams encountered enemy scouts attempting to breach the base's outer defenses. Gunfire echoed across the hills, sharp and sudden. The officer watched the live feed, noting the enemy's tactics: rapid, coordinated, and highly adaptable. They were testing the base's response time, gauging strengths and weaknesses, but doing so without overcommitting. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. Officers shouted over the noise of alerts and radio chatter, issuing orders and coordinating countermeasures. Soldiers moved with precision, blocking access points, reinforcing weak areas, and returning fire when necessary. Despite the chaos, discipline held. Each team knew their role, but the officer knew that this was only the beginning. Hours passed, and the base held its ground. Casualties were minimal, but the attacks continued, relentless yet strategic. The officer noted a disturbing pattern. The enemy attacked in waves, retreating when met with resistance, then advancing again from a different direction. They weren't reckless, they were calculating, testing human limits and patience. In the midst of the chaos, another transmission arrived, this one even more direct. "You cannot win by force alone. Your arrogance brought this upon you." The officer studied the words carefully. There was an intelligence behind them, an understanding of human psychology and strategy. It wasn't just about attacking. They were teaching a lesson, demonstrating power. He realized that the human standard protocols were insufficient. To respond effectively, he needed to anticipate the enemy, predict moves that hadn't been made yet, and stay one step ahead. He coordinated with field units, adjusting positions, reinforcing weak points, and creating contingencies for unexpected maneuvers. Outside, soldiers faced the enemy directly. The initial fear had shifted into focus and determination. They were fighting not just to protect the base, but to understand this new adversary. Every movement was observed, every engagement analyzed. The officer moved between consoles, communicating with units, giving real-time guidance. The enemy's precision was unnerving. They seemed to anticipate responses, moving almost like chess pieces across the terrain. Yet small mistakes began to appear, slight hesitations, overextensions, predictable patterns. The officer seized on these, instructing his units to exploit vulnerabilities without falling into traps. Hours turned into a long night. The stars appeared above the ridge, indifferent to the struggle below. The officer barely noticed them, consumed by monitoring, analyzing, and commanding. He felt the weight of responsibility. Lives depended on decisions made in seconds based on incomplete information and intuition. By dawn, the first wave of attacks had been repelled, though at a cost. Equipment was damaged and some soldiers were injured. The officer walked among the teams, checking on morale, ensuring communication lines were intact. The enemy had tested them and humans had endured, but the message was clear. This was only the beginning. During a quiet moment, he reviewed the transmissions again. The words from the enemy lingered in his mind. There was intent, intelligence, and strategy behind each message. They weren't mindless attackers, they were observers, analysts, and tacticians. Humans had entered a game they didn't fully understand, and the rules were not theirs to dictate. He called a meeting with senior officers. The discussion was tense but necessary. They reviewed every engagement, every movement, every decision made in the past night. The officer emphasized the importance of learning, adaptation, and anticipating the enemy's next moves. "We survived the first strike," he said, "but surviving is not winning. We must understand them, predict them, and respond with precision if we are to have any chance." Outside, the enemy had withdrawn from immediate engagement, leaving behind faint signs of their presence. Vehicles and equipment were gone, but the patterns of movement, the strategy employed, and the messages left behind all indicated a deliberate, careful approach. They had struck to test, to warn, and to assert dominance without committing fully. The officer spent the remaining hours of the day analyzing every detail. The base had survived, but barely. The enemy's intelligence and planning were evident in every move. He realized that conventional strategies would not suffice in the future. Adaptation, creativity, and foresight would be crucial. By evening, the base had returned to a semblance of calm. Soldiers cleaned equipment, reinforced defenses, and rested in brief moments of respite. The officer walked through the command center, checking systems, monitoring alerts, and ensuring readiness. He knew the enemy would strike again, and when they did, the humans would need every advantage they could muster. He stood at the balcony overlooking the hills once more, watching the horizon for any sign of movement. The enemy was out there, hidden, waiting, observing. Their final message from last night rang in his mind. "You underestimated us. This is what happens when humans declare war without understanding the cost." The words carried a warning that would not be forgotten. The officer felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. They had survived the first strike, but the true battle, the one that would test human strategy, resilience, and courage, was still ahead. And he knew, without doubt, that they had been marked as opponents in a game far more complex than anything they had ever faced. The night descended again, the stars above calm and distant, indifferent to the struggle below. Inside the base, the hum of machines and faint murmur of voices continued. But behind the calm tension and preparation thrummed in every corridor, every console, and every soldier's mind. The first strike had ended, but the real challenge had just begun, and everyone knew it. The day after the first strike began quietly, almost deceptively so. The base seemed calm on the surface, but inside, tension simmered like a pot just below the boil. The officer spent the early morning walking through the command center, checking every monitor, every system, and every alert. The attacks had shown one undeniable truth. The enemy was intelligent, patient, and highly strategic. They had studied human behavior, predicted reactions, and exploited weaknesses with calculated precision. Soldiers moved about the base, performing routine checks and repairs. Yet their faces betrayed unease. Everyone understood that what had happened the night before was only the beginning. Casual chatter was minimal, replaced by low conversations filled with speculation and concern. They had survived the first strike, but the cost was more than just physical damage. It was a psychological test. Fear and vigilance had intertwined, and the officer could feel it pressing down on every person around him. He gathered the senior officers in the operations room. Maps, satellite feeds, and communication logs were spread across the table. The officer pointed to the ridge where the first attack had originated. "They hit us here first," he said, "but notice the pattern. They didn't strike all at once. Each movement was calculated to test our defenses, to see where we are strong and where we are weak. They are studying us." One of the officers leaned forward, eyebrows furrowed. "So what does that mean for us now? Do we expect another strike today?" The officer didn't hesitate. "Yes, and it will be bigger, faster, and smarter. If we rely on the same strategies as yesterday, we will fail." Outside, the sun rose, higher, casting sharp light on the hills and valleys around the base. The officer moved to the balcony, scanning the terrain. Small movements caught his eye, dust kicking up in the distance, shadows shifting. It was subtle, but he could sense that units were positioning themselves beyond the ridge, hidden yet alert. The enemy was patient. They were preparing for the next wave, studying every reaction from the humans below. Back inside, technicians monitored the communication channels. Another transmission arrived, this one even more direct than before. "You think yesterday was a warning? You have not seen the beginning. Prepare to understand why you were mistaken." The message caused a collective chill among the officers. Its calm tone belied the threat it carried. The enemy wasn't just attacking, they were making a point, asserting control through strategy and psychological pressure. The officer analyzed the message carefully, searching for clues. He noticed patterns in the timing and frequency of transmissions, hints that suggested the enemy was coordinating with multiple units simultaneously. It wasn't just a frontal assault. They were orchestrating a complex, multi-pronged approach. By mid-morning, reports started coming in from the perimeter teams. Small enemy units had appeared near outposts further from the base than before, testing response times, reconnaissance abilities, and communication channels. The officer recognized the pattern immediately. Each encounter was deliberate. Each withdrawal was designed to teach, to probe, and to gather intelligence on human reactions. "Units at all checkpoints," he commanded. "Remain alert, but do not engage unless necessary. Report movements immediately. Every action we take must be measured." Soldiers moved into position, eyes scanning the hills, weapons ready. Even the smallest anomaly, a glint of metal, a shadow, was enough to draw immediate attention. The base had learned from the first strike. Caution was now more important than aggression. The officer walked between consoles, coordinating with field commanders. Reports flowed in, detailing enemy movements, reconnaissance patterns, and equipment usage. Every piece of information was cross-checked, analyzed, and stored. The officer knew that the enemy was intelligent, and the only way to survive the next strikes was to match that intelligence with careful observation and adaptive strategy. Suddenly, a sensor alert blared. A unit of enemy vehicles was advancing along a ridge previously thought secure. The officer's heart raced, not with fear, but with the urgency of immediate action. He issued orders quickly, rerouting defensive teams, adjusting artillery positions, and sending drones for real-time surveillance. The attack began in waves. Small squads appeared first, attempting to breach perimeter fences and observation posts. Soldiers responded with precision, using cover and coordinated fire to repel them. Yet the officer noticed something unsettling. Each wave was different, adapting to human responses, learning from the mistakes or successes of previous attacks. The enemy was evolving in real time. Inside the command center, tension rose sharply. Officers shouted over radios, coordinating reinforcements and monitoring casualties. Every decision was critical. Even minor missteps could allow the enemy to gain ground. The officer felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Lives depended on every command he gave, every analysis he made. During a brief lull, another transmission appeared on the secure channel. "Your defenses are strong, but your tactics are predictable. You will learn soon that strength alone cannot save you." The message was almost taunting, designed to instill doubt and force the humans into mistakes. The officer studied it carefully. There was intelligence in the choice of words, a clear understanding of human psychology. The enemy wasn't just testing firepower, they were testing minds, strategy, and patience. By afternoon, the attacks had escalated. Larger units appeared, moving in coordinated formations. Drones detected advanced equipment, vehicles capable of rapid movement and precision targeting. The officer observed everything, marking patterns and predicting next moves. He issued new orders: rotate units, create decoy positions, reinforce weak areas, and prepare for unpredictable strikes. The soldiers adapted quickly, though exhaustion was beginning to show. The officer moved among them, offering encouragement, guidance, and reassurance. He reminded them that every action they took, every observation, mattered. They were not just defending a base, they were learning, adapting, and surviving against an enemy that was methodical and intelligent. The enemy, however, was relentless. They withdrew and reappeared, striking from unexpected angles using terrain to their advantage. Each maneuver was precise, calculated, and designed to test human coordination. The officer realized that conventional defensive strategies would not be enough. He needed to innovate, to anticipate movements before they happened, and to trust the judgment of his teams. By evening, the officer reviewed the day's encounters. Casualties were higher than the first strike, equipment had been damaged, but the base still stood. The enemy had tested human limits, observing reactions, learning strengths, and exploiting weaknesses. The officer understood one crucial fact: the enemy was not just strong, they were smart, patient, and adaptive. He convened a meeting with the senior officers. The discussion was intense, focused on analyzing every movement, every pattern, every message received. "We are being studied," he said firmly. "Every wave, every withdrawal, every transmission is deliberate. They are gathering intelligence to prepare for a larger strike. We cannot afford to react impulsively." The officers agreed and plans were adjusted. New defensive strategies were implemented, rotating teams to prevent predictability, using decoys to confuse enemy reconnaissance, and increasing surveillance with drones and sensors. Every action was deliberate, every movement calculated to anticipate the enemy. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hills. The base had survived another day, but the officer knew that the enemy would strike again, stronger and more coordinated. He walked along the balcony looking at the horizon, imagining the movements of units hidden in the terrain beyond sight. The message from earlier continued to echo in his mind. Strength alone cannot save you. He understood now that this war was not just about firepower, it was a test of intelligence, strategy, and resilience. The humans had survived the first strike and adapted to the second, but the real challenge was yet to come. They would need every ounce of skill, courage, and observation to withstand what was coming. Night fell completely, leaving the hills dark and foreboding. The base remained vigilant, lights glowing softly from windows and consoles. Soldiers kept watch, machines hummed steadily, and officers analyzed every piece of information available. Outside, the enemy remained hidden, waiting, observing, and planning. The officer returned to the command center one last time before resting. He reviewed all transmissions, all movements, and every engagement of the day. The patterns were clear now. The enemy was deliberate, intelligent, and patient. The humans had learned something vital from the first strikes. Survival required more than strength. It required adaptation, foresight, and discipline. As he prepared to rest for a few hours, he looked out at the darkness surrounding the base. The enemy was out there, silent and methodical, preparing for the next move. The humans had faced the first wave, adapted to the second, and survived. But the real test was only beginning. And he knew with certainty that the coming days would demand everything they had, and more. The night was heavy with tension, thick and suffocating. Inside the base, lights glowed softly, illuminating rows of consoles and blinking machines, each one quietly processing information from every corner of the surrounding hills. Soldiers moved silently through the hallways, alert but exhausted, their eyes tired from hours of vigilance. Even in moments of stillness, everyone sensed that the enemy was out there, waiting, observing, calculating. The officer in charge paced back and forth in the command center, his mind racing. Days of attacks had taught him that this enemy was unlike any they had faced before. They were not reckless. They were precise, patient, and intelligent. Every strike had a purpose. Every withdrawal carried a lesson. And now, as the hours passed, he felt that something significant was about to happen. It began with the communication alert. A sudden sharp tone echoed through the room. Technicians scrambled to answer the incoming message, their fingers moving quickly over keyboards and touchscreens. The officer leaned in, eyes narrowing as the monitor flickered to life. This time the transmission was direct, unambiguous, and unlike any they had received before. A calm, deliberate voice filled the room. "You declared war. Now we will show you why that was a mistake." The words were simple yet heavy with menace. Officers froze, absorbing the meaning. This was not just a threat, it was a declaration. The enemy was confident, asserting dominance in a way that left no room for doubt. The officer felt a chill run down his spine, but he refused to let fear take control. He knew that every word, every pause was calculated to provoke panic, to unsettle human judgment. He quickly analyzed the transmission. Its timing, content, and tone suggested more than arrogance. It contained hidden signals, patterns that indicated coordinated activity across multiple fronts. The enemy was not just making a statement. They were orchestrating a full-scale operation, and the final transmission was the prelude to it. "Trace the origin," he ordered. "We need to know where this is coming from, how they are coordinating, and what they are planning next." Every second counts. Technicians worked frantically, running algorithms and cross-referencing signals. Even with advanced technology, the enemy's methods were sophisticated, using decoys and multiple channels to mask their true positions. It was clear that they had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Meanwhile, outside the base, subtle signs of movement appeared. Shadows shifted on distant ridges, dust rose from unseen vehicles, and faint lights glimmered briefly before disappearing. Soldiers at observation posts reported anomalies, movements that were too coordinated to be random. The officer recognized the pattern immediately. The enemy was mobilizing for a larger, decisive action. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Orders flowed quickly, clearly, and decisively. Units were repositioned, defensive lines reinforced, and drones dispatched for live reconnaissance. The officer moved from console to console, coordinating with field teams, ensuring that every action was deliberate and strategic. The transmission repeated, this time with more detail. "You have underestimated us at every turn. Now face the consequences of your arrogance. We will show you what true strategy looks like." Officers exchanged worried glances. The words were more than a threat. They were a demonstration of confidence, intelligence, and control. The enemy understood human psychology. They knew that fear and hesitation could be just as damaging as physical attacks. The officer quickly gathered the senior team for an urgent meeting. "This is not just another strike," he said, pointing at the screens. "This is a message and a warning combined. They are testing us, observing our reactions, and preparing for a coordinated strike that will challenge everything we know about defense. We must respond with precision, caution, and intelligence. No mistakes." As the team worked through strategies, a new set of sensor alerts appeared. Small units were moving along the southern ridge, attempting to probe defensive weak points. Soldiers engaged, but the enemy retreated almost immediately, vanishing into terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. Every maneuver had a purpose: to test, to gather intelligence, and to prepare for something larger. The officer realized that conventional defensive strategies would not suffice. The enemy was adaptive, capable of learning from each engagement and willing to wait for the perfect opportunity. Survival would require anticipation, foresight, and a clear understanding of the adversary's capabilities. He issued new orders: rotate units to prevent predictability, deploy drones for continuous surveillance, and prepare contingency plans for multiple possible attack vectors. Soldiers adjusted positions, creating decoys and reinforcing critical areas. Every move was deliberate, designed to confuse the enemy and disrupt their strategy. Hours passed and the tension inside the base grew. The officer reviewed all intercepted communications, trying to decipher hidden meanings, patterns, and intentions. Each message, each signal offered clues, but only if interpreted correctly. One wrong assumption could lead to disaster. Suddenly, reports of unusual activity came from multiple sectors. Vehicles were moving across ridges, small units advancing and retreating in patterns that mirrored earlier transmissions. The officer quickly realized that this was not an immediate attack. It was preparation, positioning, and coordination for something much larger. The enemy was aligning forces, calculating the best time and method to strike, and they were doing so with incredible precision. The officer called for a strategic briefing with all senior field commanders. Maps were spread across tables, satellite images projected onto screens, and every possible scenario was discussed. "We are facing a highly intelligent, patient, and adaptable adversary," he explained. "They are capable of observing, learning, and exploiting weaknesses in real time. Our goal is not only to defend, but to anticipate, adapt, and survive. Predict their moves before they make them." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of the situation. The soldiers were not just defending a base, they were part of a complex game, one that tested strategy, intelligence, and human endurance. Every decision, every action, would be scrutinized by an enemy capable of learning and adjusting faster than expected. As evening approached, the final transmission repeated one more time. "You declared war. Now we will show you why that was a mistake. Observe carefully, for the lesson begins now." The officer felt the significance of the words. The enemy was making it clear that the next strike would not be random or limited. It would be deliberate, coordinated, and designed to teach the humans a lesson they would not forget. The calm tone of the message contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, a reminder that the enemy was in control, confident, and patient. He ordered all units to full alert. Defensive positions were reinforced, drones patrolled the perimeter continuously, and soldiers were briefed on multiple contingencies. Even small movements were carefully monitored, recorded, and analyzed. The officer knew that the coming hours would test their endurance, strategy, and ability to respond under pressure. Outside, the hills were dark and quiet, but the officer knew better. The enemy was there, hidden and deliberate, observing every response from the humans below. Every sensor, every camera, every patrol was feeding data back to them. The first strike had been a test. The subsequent actions were preparation, and the final transmission was the prelude to the real engagement, the one that could change everything. Inside the command center, the officer moved from console to console, coordinating defenses, reviewing strategies, and maintaining communication with field units. The tension was palpable, a constant pressure that left no room for mistakes. He reminded everyone that survival depended not on fear, but on intelligence, discipline, and coordination. As night fell completely, the officer stepped onto the balcony overlooking the base and surrounding hills. The stars above were calm and indifferent, but below the tension was electric. The enemy was out there, hidden, intelligent, and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to act. Every shadow could conceal movement. Every faint light could indicate positioning. He understood that the final transmission was not just a threat. It was a declaration of intent, a demonstration of strategy, and a warning of the challenges ahead. The humans had survived the first strikes, adapted to the tests, and learned from the enemy's movements. But the true engagement, the one that would demand everything they had, was about to begin. The officer took a deep breath and returned inside. Soldiers continued to patrol. Drones scanned the hills, and the command center hummed with quiet urgency. The final transmission had set the stage. It had made one thing clear: this was no ordinary conflict. Survival would require not just strength, but intelligence, strategy, and the ability to anticipate an enemy capable of learning and adapting faster than expected. And as the night pressed on, the officer knew that the humans would face a lesson unlike any they had ever learned, a lesson that would test courage, resilience, and the limits of their understanding. The first wave had ended, the second had escalated, and now the enemy had made their intentions unmistakable. The countdown to the next engagement had begun. The final transmission echoed in his mind. "You declared war. Now we will show you why that was a mistake." Every word carried weight, every pause carried meaning, and every action taken by the humans. The base had barely recovered from the previous attacks, yet the tension was higher than ever. The officer knew that the enemy was planning something larger, something designed to push human strategy and endurance to the limit. The final transmission had made one thing clear: this was not a random engagement. It was deliberate, calculated, and intended to teach a lesson. Early in the morning, he called a meeting with the senior officers. Maps were spread across the table, satellite feeds flickering with activity from the surrounding hills. "They are preparing for a major operation," he said. "If we want any chance of survival, we need to act before they strike fully. We cannot just defend. We have to anticipate and disrupt." The discussion was intense. Everyone understood the risks. A direct attack on the enemy would be dangerous, but the officer had identified a potential opportunity. Their main communication hub, located deep within the terrain they controlled, appeared vulnerable. If his team could intercept or disrupt it, they could gain intelligence, confuse the enemy, and possibly turn the tide. He addressed the field commanders directly. "I will lead a small team to infiltrate the hub. It is risky, but it may give us the leverage we need. Units that remain here must reinforce the base and be ready for any retaliation. Every second matters. There is no room for mistakes." The team assembled quickly, composed of the best soldiers, engineers, and intelligence officers. Each person knew the danger, yet determination shone in their eyes. Fear was present, but it was tempered by discipline, training, and the knowledge that what they were about to do could save countless lives. They moved out under the cover of early morning fog, shadows blending with the terrain. The officer led the team, checking every movement, listening carefully for any sound that seemed out of place. Even small disturbances could indicate enemy units observing them. The operation required absolute precision, silence, and coordination. For hours they navigated the ridges, valleys, and wooded areas surrounding the enemy positions. Drones provided intermittent updates, but the terrain made continuous monitoring difficult. Every step required caution. The enemy had proven intelligent and methodical, and any misstep could be fatal. Along the way, small patrols appeared. The team paused, blending into the environment, watching movements with a careful eye. When the patrols passed, they resumed their advance. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. The officer reminded everyone to stay focused. One wrong decision could compromise the entire mission. As they approached the enemy communication hub, signs of activity increased. Vehicles and small units moved with precision, coordinating actions and securing perimeters. The officer noted their patterns carefully. There were brief windows of opportunity, moments when surveillance was weaker and the risk of detection lower. These windows had to be seized. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the hub. Using handheld devices and portable jammers, the team began to interfere with external communications. The officer observed from a ridge, watching for any change in the enemy's behavior. Within minutes, small disruptions appeared. Units hesitated, movements became less coordinated, and signals were partially scrambled. The operation was working, but the enemy quickly adapted. A countermeasure appeared almost immediately, attempting to trace the source of the disruption. The officer signaled the team to relocate, moving to a secondary position to continue the operation. Precision, patience, and adaptation were key. The enemy's intelligence and speed forced constant recalibration. Hours passed, and the officer began to notice something important. By monitoring the enemy's communications, he was beginning to understand their strategy. The timing of attacks, patterns of movement, and deployment of resources revealed vulnerabilities that had not been obvious before. It was a breakthrough, a glimpse into the enemy's planning that could change the course of the conflict. He relayed instructions to the team. Focus on signals related to logistics and coordination. We need to identify their command structure. Every message intercepted gives us leverage. The team worked tirelessly, decoding transmissions, analyzing patterns, and mapping movements. Each discovery allowed them to anticipate future strikes more accurately. For the first time, it felt as though they were not just reacting. They were predicting, understanding, and countering. Suddenly, a new challenge appeared. A small enemy patrol approached, moving directly toward their position. The team froze, weighing options. A direct confrontation could alert the entire hub, but avoiding them would take time and risk missing critical signals. The officer made a split-second decision. Using the terrain, the team blended with the shadows, moving silently along a ridge that allowed them to bypass the patrol undetected. Once the patrol passed, they resumed operations. The officer reviewed the intercepted signals, mapping patterns that suggested an upcoming coordinated attack on the base. Timing, sequence, and location were becoming clearer. If this information could be relayed back immediately, defensive preparations could be adjusted, reducing risk to the soldiers remaining at the base. Using secure channels and encrypted devices, the officer transmitted the findings back to command. Within minutes, adjustments were made. Units repositioned, reinforcements dispatched, and weak points strengthened. The operation at the hub had already begun to save lives. As the team continued to monitor the hub, they discovered the enemy's vulnerability. A critical control node, essential for coordinating multiple units, was unguarded for brief intervals during communication cycles. The officer realized that if they could exploit this, they could disrupt the enemy's entire strategy, at least temporarily. He coordinated with engineers to prepare a targeted interference that would scramble signals long enough to give the humans an advantage. Timing had to be perfect. One mistake could expose their presence and trigger immediate retaliation. Every member of the team understood the stakes. The interference was executed with precision. Signals were scrambled, coordination faltered, and for the first time enemy movements showed confusion. Small units hesitated, vehicles stalled, and some orders were ignored. The officer watched closely, ensuring the operation remained controlled. It was a moment of relief and hope, a sign that careful planning and intelligence could counter the enemy's superior preparation. Yet danger remained. Any moment the enemy could detect the source and retaliate with full force. The officer signaled the team to withdraw carefully, retracing their steps through the terrain. Every movement was deliberate, silent, and coordinated. The fog that had concealed them in the morning was now thicker, providing natural cover for their retreat. As they moved back, the officer reflected on the mission. For hours they had faced danger, uncertainty, and exhaustion, yet the breakthroughs achieved during the operation had changed the game. They had gained intelligence, disrupted enemy coordination, and proven that human strategy, patience, and careful observation could make a difference even against an adaptable and intelligent adversary. The team returned to the base as the sun began to set. Soldiers at the perimeter were relieved to see them, knowing that the risks taken had directly strengthened the base's defensive capabilities. The officer briefed the command center on the operation's results, highlighting key vulnerabilities discovered and lessons learned. Every piece of intelligence would be used to prepare for the next engagement. For the first time since the conflict began, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The humans had faced the enemy in their territory, navigated extreme risk, and gained a decisive advantage. The officer knew, however, that this was only temporary. The enemy would adapt, learn, and strike again. But now humans had insight, understanding, and a plan informed by direct observation of the adversary. As evening turned to night, the officer walked along the base's outer perimeter. Soldiers patrolled quietly. The hum of machines continued and drones monitored the surrounding terrain. The operation had succeeded, but the tension remained. The enemy had been shown human capability, intelligence, and determination. The next engagement would be critical and preparation would be essential. He looked out at the horizon, shadows of the hills stretching across the landscape. Somewhere out there the enemy was observing, learning, and recalculating. But for now, humans had taken the initiative. The breakthrough at the communication hub had provided knowledge, confidence, and the first real chance to shift the balance. Inside the base, the command center buzzed quietly with activity. Signals were monitored, reports analyzed, and strategies refined. Every person understood that survival depended on intelligence, adaptation, and courage. The officer knew that the coming days would demand even more, but the breakthrough from this mission gave hope. For the first time, humans were not just reacting, they were thinking ahead, planning and shaping the battlefield. And as the night deepened, the officer prepared for the inevitable. The enemy had been tested, disrupted, and observed. Humans had learned, adapted, and gained critical insight. The next strike would come, but now the humans were ready in ways they had never been before. The officer allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. For hours they had faced danger, uncertainty, and high stakes. They had succeeded where many might have failed. The breakthrough was not just tactical, it was psychological. Confidence, no. The night was calm, but the base remained on high alert. After the risky mission to the enemy communication hub, everyone understood that this calm was temporary. The officer knew that the enemy had been observing the humans' actions carefully, analyzing every decision, and now, with intelligence disrupted, they would reconsider their strategy. The next engagement could come at any moment. Inside the command center, screens displayed maps, sensor readings, and live drone feeds. Officers and soldiers worked quietly but efficiently, cross-referencing data and preparing for all possible scenarios. Every team had a role and every action was deliberate. The operation at the hub had given them valuable intelligence, but it had also provoked the enemy. Patience, focus, and coordination were now more important than ever. The officer walked between consoles, checking status updates and speaking briefly with field commanders. "We know they are out there," he said calmly. "They have learned from our disruption and they will respond. Our job is to be ready, to anticipate, and to act with precision. This is the moment we have been preparing for." As the hours passed, subtle signs of movement appeared on the hills surrounding the base. Shadows shifted, distant lights flickered, and sensor alerts registered minor disturbances. The enemy was returning, but they were cautious. Every unit moved with deliberate precision, aware that the humans had learned from previous strikes. The officer realized that the next battle would not be about speed alone. It would be about strategy, adaptability, and focus. He gathered the senior officers for a final briefing. "This is what we've trained for," he said. "They are testing us again, but this time, we have the advantage of knowledge. Their patterns, weaknesses, and timing are clearer. We must use every tool, every skill, and every observation to maintain the upper hand. Confidence is critical. Hesitation will be costly." Soldiers prepared weapons, reinforced positions, and coordinated with drone operators. Engineers checked communication systems, ensuring secure lines for the field units. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Everyone understood that this engagement could be decisive. Lives, the integrity of the base, and the results of all previous operations depended on their vigilance. As dusk approached, the first wave of enemy units appeared. They moved quickly, but this time humans were ready. Drones tracked every movement, allowing soldiers to anticipate positions and intercept units before they could reach critical points. Defensive lines were reinforced at vulnerable sectors, and communication relays ensured rapid coordination between teams. The officer watched the live feeds closely. The enemy had adapted since the disruption at their hub, but the humans had also learned. Units moved with coordinated precision, exploiting patterns observed in previous attacks. Small mistakes by the enemy were immediately noted and used to redirect defensive focus. For the first time, humans weren't just reacting, they were predicting. The battle escalated. Explosions echoed through the hills. Vehicles maneuvered to strategic positions, and soldiers engaged enemy units with calculated fire. Every action was measured, every decision deliberate. The officer noticed how the enemy had changed tactics, yet each new maneuver could be countered using insights gained from prior intelligence. Inside the command center, communication channels buzzed with activity. Teams reported successes, setbacks, and observations. The officer coordinated reinforcements, ensured no gaps appeared in defenses, and adjusted strategies in real time. The battlefield was alive, dynamic, and challenging, but humans were now responding as a cohesive, adaptive unit. Hours into the engagement, a critical opportunity emerged. The officer noticed that a key enemy formation, responsible for coordinating attacks in multiple sectors, was momentarily exposed. This unit had not adjusted quickly enough after their communication hub had been disrupted. Recognizing the potential, he quickly devised a plan. "Focus fire on the exposed formation," he instructed. "Use drones to monitor flanks and ensure minimal risk to our positions. Precision and coordination are essential." This could shift the balance. Soldiers executed the order flawlessly. Coordinated strikes, informed by real-time intelligence, disrupted the enemy formation. Vehicles stalled, communications were interrupted, and units were forced to retreat. For the first time, the humans had not only defended, but had gained a clear advantage in the battlefield. The officer allowed himself a brief moment to acknowledge the significance. Years of training, preparation, observation, and careful planning had culminated in this moment. Survival had depended not only on courage, but on intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to learn from every engagement. As the night deepened, enemy movements slowed. Units began to withdraw from the front lines, regrouping behind ridges and natural barriers. The humans maintained vigilance, ensuring that no surprise attacks could disrupt their positions. Every team remained on alert, Yet there was a growing sense of accomplishment. The officer convened the senior officers to analyze the engagement. Maps, feeds, and reports were reviewed. The enemy had shown intelligence, adaptability, and patience, but the humans had matched them in strategy, prediction, and coordination. This battle, unlike previous strikes, had been a turning point. Today we faced an intelligent and patient adversary, the officer said. They have tested us, pushed us to our limits, and shown us the importance of observation and adaptability. But we have proven that humans are capable of learning, adapting, and overcoming even the most calculated attacks. We survived, we disrupted their strategy, and we gained critical intelligence. This is a victory, but one that comes with responsibility. We must continue to learn and prepare. Soldiers, exhausted but alert, moved through the base, checking equipment, reinforcing defenses, and attending to the injured. Every person understood that the engagement was a lesson in vigilance, strategy, and resilience. The operation at the enemy hub and the ensuing battle had shown that preparation, intelligence, and courage could outweigh brute force. The officer walked through the quiet corridors of the base. Lights glowed softly, consoles hummed, and soldiers carried out routine tasks with careful attention. He reflected on the journey so far: the first strike, the probing attacks, the final transmission, and the risky operation that had given them insight into the enemy's strategy. Every step had built toward this moment. Outside, the stars shone above the hills, calm and distant, indifferent to the human struggle below. Yet beneath that calm, the terrain had changed. Humans had observed, adapted, and acted with intelligence. The enemy had been challenged, disrupted, and forced to reconsider their strategy. The balance had shifted, even if only temporarily. The officer paused at the balcony, looking out across the hills. Shadows of vehicles and equipment remained faint in the moonlight, signs of the enemy's presence and retreat. He knew they would return, that intelligence could be rebuilt and strategies could be adjusted. Yet for now, humans had demonstrated capability, resilience, and the power of careful observation. Inside the command center, reports continued to flow. Engineers verified systems, communication lines were secured, and soldiers rotated through patrols. The officer ensured that readiness remained high, even in the aftermath of a hard-fought engagement. He understood that vigilance and preparation were ongoing responsibilities, not momentary actions. The breakthrough achieved at the enemy hub had been decisive. Humans had learned patterns, vulnerabilities, and communication structures. The tactical advantage gained had allowed the base to respond effectively, anticipate attacks, and disrupt enemy coordination. The engagement was not just a battle, it was proof that intelligence, strategy, and courage could counter even the most calculated and patient adversary. As the night passed, the officer took a moment to reflect on the broader significance. This was not simply survival or defense. It was a demonstration of human capacity for adaptation, learning, and strategic thinking. Each soldier, engineer, and officer had contributed to a collective effort that balanced skill, courage, and intelligence. The first strikes had been tests. The final transmission had been a challenge. And now, after careful preparation, risk, and execution, humans had faced the adversary head-on, disrupted their strategy, and gained insight critical for the future. It was a moment of triumph born from observation, patience, and courage. Morning approached, and the base remained on alert. Soldiers moved through routines with quiet confidence. Drones patrolled the perimeter, sensors recorded activity in real time, and communication systems remained secure. The officer knew that vigilance was ongoing, but there was a sense of accomplishment, a recognition that human adaptability had been proven under extreme pressure. He addressed the command center. This engagement has shown what we are capable of when we work together, observe carefully, and adapt quickly. Intelligence, preparation, and courage have allowed us to disrupt a powerful, intelligent adversary. We have survived, learned, and gained a strategic advantage, but our work continues. We must remain vigilant, for the challenges ahead will be even greater. Today we have shown that humans are capable, determined, and resilient. Remember that. As the officer left the command center, the sun began to rise over the hills. Light spread across the terrain, illuminating the base and distant ridges. The enemy was still out there, hidden, a